In April of 1925, 3 men walked into the Amazon rainforest and vanished without a trace. One was Percy Harrison Fawcett, a decorated British explorer who had survived 7 previous expeditions to the most dangerous regions of South America. With him walked his 21-year-old son Jack and Jack's closest friend Raleigh Rimmel, barely 22 years old. They carried minimal supplies, no radio, and only the vaguest itinerary. Fawcett had told no one their exact destination. What they sought was a lost city of stone and gold that existed, according to most experts, only in legend and indigenous folklore, a place Fawcett called simply Zed. The jungle swallowed them completely. Not one member of the expedition was ever seen again. Their disappearance would spawn the greatest manhunt in exploration history, claiming over 100 additional lives across the decades. Yet Fawcett's obsession with his phantom city would prove in ways he could never have imagined to be vindicated by history itself. This account draws primarily from Fawcett's own expeditionary journals, preserved in the archives of the Royal Geographical Society, and from the letters he wrote to his wife Nina during his final, fatal journey. Additional perspective comes from the testimonies of indigenous peoples who encountered him, the reports of the searchers who followed in his footsteps, and the modern archaeological discoveries that have transformed our understanding of what the Amazon once contained. Percy Harrison Fawcett was born on August 18, 1867, in the seaside town of Torquay, Devon, where the salt wind from the English Channel carried the dreams of distant shores into the nurseries of Victorian children. His father, Edward Boyd Fawcett, was a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and a man whose mind lived perpetually elsewhere, lost in cricket statistics, mathematical theorems, and the philosophical implications of Darwin's work. His mother, Myra Elizabeth, possessed the kind of restless energy that found domestic life suffocating. She filled their home with talk of exotic places and famous explorers, planting seeds in young Percy's imagination that would grow into an obsession capable of destroying him. The England of Fawcett's youth was an empire at its zenith, its maps painted red across 6 continents. Yet for all its global reach, there remained vast spaces marked simply unexplored, blank regions that called to men with the particular combination of courage and madness required for their investigation. The Amazon basin was the largest of these blanks, a green void the size of Australia where rivers ran unmarked and entire civilizations might rise and fall beyond the knowledge of the civilized world. Fawcett inherited his father's scholarly disposition, but coupled it with a physical restlessness that made classroom learning torture. At 18, he entered the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, where future artillery officers learned the mathematics of trajectory and destruction. He proved gifted at surveying and cartography, skills that would later recommend him to the Royal Geographical Society. But his real education came during his first posting to Ceylon in 1886. The island now called Sri Lanka was then a jewel of the British Empire, its highlands carpeted with tea plantations and its coasts lined with coconut palms. For a young officer raised in the gray dampness of Devon, Ceylon was a revelation of color and heat and impossibility. The jungle pressed against every cleared space with vegetative violence. Leopards padded through tea estates at night. Elephants appeared without warning on mountain roads, intelligent eyes regarding the red-coated intruders with ancient patience. But it was in North Africa, during his second posting in 1893, that Fawcett discovered his peculiar genius for survival in hostile environments. The garrison at Malta was a stepping stone to campaigns across the Mediterranean, and Fawcett found himself surveying the deserts of North Africa for military maps that would guide future campaigns. Here, under a sun that could kill a man in hours, he learned to travel light, to read landscape like a book, and to endure hardship that broke other men. His body adapted to extremes with unusual efficiency. At 5 feet 9 inches, he carried no excess weight on his compact frame. His hair was light brown, his eyes pale blue, and his skin bore the permanent tan of a man who lived outdoors. He moved with the economy of motion typical of career soldiers, but there was something else in his bearing. a quality of watchful intelligence that suggested depths beneath the surface. In 1901, he married Nina Agnes Patterson, a woman whose spirit matched his own appetite for adventure. She was small and dark-haired, with the kind of beauty that intensified under pressure rather than wilting beneath it. Their courtship unfolded through letters written from remote postings, each missive carrying the promise of shared adventures in places neither had yet seen. Nina understood that she was marrying not just a man, but an inclination toward the impossible. Their early married life was spent in Ceylon, where Fawcett had been promoted to captain and assigned increasingly challenging surveying missions. He mapped regions that existed on no previous chart, walking compass lines through jungle so thick that noon felt like twilight. His teams consisted of local guides whose knowledge of the terrain was encyclopedic, British surveyors whose health invariably failed, and indigenous laborers who carried the expedition's life on their backs through terrain that seemed designed to kill human beings. It was during these Ceylon expeditions that Fawcett developed the philosophy that would later make him famous, and ultimately destroy him. He learned to travel with minimal supplies, believing that large expeditions were more vulnerable than small ones. He studied indigenous techniques for jungle survival, abandoning European prejudices about savage methods in favor of practical effectiveness. Most importantly, he developed an almost mystical faith in his ability to survive where other men died. This faith was not entirely misplaced. His reputation within military surveying circles grew with each successful mission. He could walk 40 miles through roadless jungle, live for weeks on indigenous foods that made other Europeans violently ill, and navigate by stars through regions where magnetic compasses spun uselessly. His reports were models of precision and clarity, his maps works of art that transformed blank spaces into comprehensible geography. But Fawcett was changing in ways that would have profound consequences for his future. The jungle was working on him as it worked on all men who spent too long within its embrace, stripping away the accumulated certainties of civilization and replacing them with something more primal. He began to believe that the indigenous peoples he encountered possessed knowledge that European science had forgotten or never discovered. Their stories of lost cities and ancient civilizations, dismissed by most colonials as fantasy, struck him as deserving serious investigation. In 1903, their first son was born, Brian, a child who would grow up to inherit his father's obsession with exploration, but none of his survival instincts. 2 years later came Jack, the boy who would one day follow his father into the Amazon and disappear forever. Fawcett adored his children, but fatherhood only intensified his awareness of time's passage. He was 38 years old, at the peak of his physical powers, with a reputation that opened doors throughout the British Empire. If he was ever to undertake truly significant exploration, the time was approaching. The opportunity arrived in 1906 in the form of a letter from the Royal Geographical Society in London. The governments of Brazil and Bolivia were disputing their mutual border in a region so remote that no reliable map existed to settle the question. They had agreed to accept the arbitration of an impartial surveyor, and the Royal Geographical Society had recommended Major Percy Harrison Fawcett for the task. The assignment would require at least 2 years in the field, mapping thousands of square miles of unmapped Amazon basin. The mortality rate among previous surveyors had been catastrophic. The salary was modest. The scientific importance was enormous. Fawcett accepted immediately. Nina understood what this meant. Her husband was choosing the Amazon over domestic security, the unknown over the predictable, the possibility of immortal fame over the certainty of comfortable retirement. She was pregnant with their third child, Douglas, and would raise their children essentially as a single mother, while Percy disappeared into the world's most dangerous wilderness. Yet she not only accepted his decision but encouraged it, recognizing that attempting to cage a man like Fawcett would destroy him more surely than any jungle fever. The preparations consumed months of meticulous planning. Fawcett studied every available map of the region, quickly discovering that most were wildly inaccurate and some entirely fictional. He corresponded with previous expedition survivors, learning from their mistakes and their limited successes. He assembled equipment lists that balanced necessity against weight, knowing that every ounce would have to be carried on human backs through roadless terrain. Most crucially, he began studying Portuguese and Spanish while refreshing his knowledge of basic surveying Portuguese. The borderlands between Brazil and Bolivia contained indigenous peoples who had been in contact with colonial authorities for centuries, but many spoke only tribal languages incomprehensible to outsiders. Communication would be a matter of life and death, and Fawcett's linguistic abilities would determine whether indigenous groups received his expedition as guests or enemies. His team for the first expedition was deliberately small: 2 British assistants, both military men with surveying experience, a handful of Brazilian guides provided by the government in Rio de Janeiro, and indigenous laborers to be recruited locally as needed. Fawcett's philosophy was already emerging. Large expeditions attracted attention, consumed resources, and presented too many opportunities for discipline to break down. A small group of carefully chosen men could move faster, live off the land more easily, and present less threat to indigenous peoples who might otherwise attack preemptively. The expedition departed from Liverpool in January 1907 aboard a steamship bound for Rio de Janeiro. As the English coast disappeared behind the vessel's wake, Fawcett stood at the stern watching his old life shrink to a thin line on the horizon. He was 40 years old, at the height of his powers, embarking on work that would either make his reputation or kill him outright. In his pocket was a letter from Nina, to be opened only in extremity. In his cabin were surveying instruments whose precision would determine the boundaries between nations. In his imagination was a vision of blank spaces on the map gradually filling with the careful notations of scientific exploration. He had no way of knowing that this first expedition would begin an obsession that would consume the remaining 18 years of his life, drive him deeper into the Amazon than any European had traveled, and ultimately lead him to seek something far more dangerous than mere geographic boundaries: a lost city that might not exist, in a region that had already killed every previous expedition sent to find it. The ship steamed south through waters that grew progressively warmer, carrying Percy Fawcett toward his destiny with a mystery that would outlive him by a century. The Atlantic crossing took 3 weeks, during which Fawcett refined his plans and studied the sparse documentation available about his destination. The disputed border region lay in the heart of South America, where the headwaters of the Amazon system braided through terrain that had never been accurately mapped. Previous expeditions had died of fever, been killed by indigenous peoples, or simply disappeared into the green immensity without sending word of their fate. What made this particular assignment especially challenging was the nature of the border dispute itself. Both Brazil and Bolivia claimed sovereignty over territories containing valuable rubber trees, the source of a commodity that had made men rich and nations powerful. The Berlin Conference of 1884 had established principles for resolving such conflicts, but applying European diplomatic theory to Amazonian reality required first determining what exactly existed on the ground. Rivers changed course. Tribal territories overlapped in complex patterns. What appeared on maps as clearly defined boundaries dissolved into ambiguity when confronted with actual landscape. Fawcett's task was to survey approximately 1,500 miles of frontier, establishing astronomical observations that would fix key points with mathematical precision. These coordinates would then become the basis for diplomatic negotiations that would determine which nation controlled which resources. It was work that demanded not only surveying expertise but also diplomatic skill, since he would be operating with authorities from both countries while maintaining strict neutrality. The steamship reached Rio de Janeiro in early February 1907, and Fawcett got his first taste of the country that would dominate the rest of his life. The city sprawled around its famous harbor like an amphitheater, mountains rising directly from the sea to heights that challenged the eye. The air was thick with humidity and rich with unfamiliar scents: tropical flowers, coffee beans drying in the sun, and underneath it all, the green smell of vegetation growing with jungle intensity. Brazil's capital was then entering its Belle Epoque, funded by rubber wealth flowing from the Amazon and coffee profits from the southern plantations. The streets buzzed with construction projects designed to transform Rio into the Paris of South America. Electric streetcars climbed impossibly steep hillsides. The newly constructed Teatro Municipal rivaled opera houses in Europe. Wealthy Brazilians spoke French by preference and sent their children to be educated in European capitals. But beneath this cosmopolitan veneer, Fawcett sensed the presence of something older and more mysterious. Indigenous peoples moved through the modern city like ghosts of an earlier age, their knowledge of the interior regions dismissed by urban sophisticates who had never ventured beyond the coastal plantations. In the markets, Fawcett encountered foods, medicines, and handicrafts that spoke of civilizations whose sophistication had been systematically underestimated by European observers. His meetings with Brazilian officials were cordial, but revealed the complexity of his assignment. The border region was inhabited by indigenous groups whose loyalties belonged neither to Brazil nor Bolivia, but to tribal territories that predated both nations by centuries. Some groups had been in contact with colonial authorities and could be approached through established protocols. Others remained completely isolated, their reactions to outsiders unpredictable and potentially violent. The logistics of reaching the disputed territory were daunting. The nearest railroad terminated hundreds of miles from the border region. River transport was possible for part of the journey, but the rivers themselves were obstacles. Seasonal floods, deadly rapids, and sandbars that shifted with every rise and fall of water levels. The final approach would have to be made on foot through terrain where every mile had to be cut with machetes and every river forded without bridges. Fawcett's Brazilian escorts included Dr. Antonio Carlos de Barros, a government surveyor with extensive Amazonian experience, and 2 military engineers whose job was to ensure that the expedition maintained official credibility with local authorities. The team's equipment filled several canoes, surveying instruments protected in waterproof cases, camping gear designed for extreme conditions, medical supplies that represented the expedition's only defense against tropical diseases, and trade goods for establishing peaceful relations with indigenous peoples. The trade goods deserved particular attention since they would often determine whether the expedition was received as guests or enemies. Fawcett had studied reports from previous expeditions to learn which items indigenous peoples valued most highly. Mirrors were universally appreciated, as were metal tools that could accomplish in minutes work that required hours with traditional implements. Colored cloth, glass beads, and small bells had decorative value that transcended practical utility. Most importantly, Fawcett carried medical supplies that could demonstrate European healing techniques, establishing his credentials as a person whose presence brought benefits rather than threats. The journey into the interior began in March 1907 with a river voyage up the Paraguay River system. The steamboat that carried them was a flat-bottomed craft designed specifically for navigating seasonal waterways, its shallow draft allowing passage over sandbars that would ground deeper vessels. The passengers included government officials traveling to remote postings, traders carrying manufactured goods to exchange for jungle products, and missionaries whose destination were indigenous communities that existed as dots on ecclesiastical maps. As the boat pushed upstream against the muddy current, the landscape gradually transformed from coastal sophistication to frontier primitiveness. Plantations gave way to ranches, ranches to small settlements, settlements to isolated trading posts where a handful of buildings represented the furthest advance of Brazilian civilization. The river itself became the expedition's highway, its banks lined with vegetation so dense that landing required cutting through walls of green growth. Fawcett spent the river journey studying his companions and refining his understanding of the challenges ahead. Dr. Barros proved to be an invaluable source of information about indigenous peoples, having spent years establishing peaceful contact with previously hostile tribes. His approach was based on patience, respect, and the gradual building of trust through repeated small gestures of goodwill. He warned Fawcett that the border region contained groups that had experienced traumatic contact with rubber tappers, creating suspicion of all outsiders that could explode into violence without warning. The military engineers, by contrast, approached the expedition with an attitude that Fawcett found troubling. They viewed indigenous peoples as obstacles to be overcome rather than human beings deserving respect, and they carried weapons with an eagerness that suggested they expected to use them. Fawcett realized that managing his own team's behavior would be as challenging as navigating the physical dangers of the jungle. After 2 weeks of river travel, they reached the end of navigable water and began the overland portion of the journey. The transition from boat to foot travel marked the expedition's passage from the edges of civilization into terra incognita. Their progress slowed to a few miles per day as they cut paths through vegetation that seemed designed to impede human movement. Vines hung in dense curtains between trees whose canopy blocked most sunlight. The forest floor was a maze of fallen logs, hidden streams, and mud that could swallow a man to his waist. The sounds of the jungle created a constant symphony that was both beautiful and ominous. Birds called from invisible perches with voices that ranged from liquid melody to harsh alarm. Insects buzzed with intensities that suggested vast numbers and voracious appetites. Somewhere in the distance, howler monkeys roared their territorial claims with voices that carried for miles through the humid air. But it was the silences that proved most unnerving. Sudden cessations of sound that suggested the presence of predators large enough to make the entire forest hold its breath. Fawcett's first encounter with indigenous peoples occurred 3 weeks into the overland journey, when the expedition discovered a recently abandoned settlement beside a tributary stream. The village consisted of several large communal houses constructed from palm logs and thatched with leaves, their architecture perfectly adapted to the tropical climate. Gardens showed evidence of sophisticated agriculture, manioc, plantains, and fruits that grew nowhere else in the world. Fish traps in the stream demonstrated engineering skills that European visitors consistently underestimated. The inhabitants had departed recently enough that cooking fires still smoldered, but they had taken everything portable and left no indication of their identity or destination. Doctor. Barros interpreted this as a positive sign, suggesting that the village's inhabitants had received advance warning of the expedition's approach and had chosen avoidance rather than confrontation. The alternative, that they were being stalked by invisible observers who would attack when the moment seemed favorable, was too disturbing to discuss openly. That night, camping in the abandoned village, Fawcett experienced his first taste of the psychological pressure that would eventually drive him to seek something far beyond the scope of his original assignment. The jungle surrounded their camp with a presence that felt almost sentient. Every sound suggested possible danger. Every shadow might conceal watching eyes. The darkness was so complete that the light from their fire seemed to push against it like a physical force, creating a tiny bubble of visibility in an ocean of blackness. Yet instead of finding this isolation terrifying, Fawcett discovered in himself a peculiar exhilaration. This was exploration in its purest form, the penetration of unknown regions where human beings had to rely entirely on their own resources for survival. The jungle was testing him, and he was proving equal to its challenges. His body was adapting to the climate with surprising ease. His mind was learning to read the subtle signs that marked safe campsites from dangerous ones. Most importantly, his imagination was beginning to grasp the vast scope of what lay hidden in these unmapped regions. If indigenous peoples could create settlements of such sophistication in areas that Europeans considered uninhabitable, what other achievements might exist deeper in the forest? The abandoned village was evidence of organizational abilities and technical knowledge that contradicted every assumption about primitive peoples that Fawcett had absorbed during his military education. He found himself wondering what discoveries awaited explorers willing to venture further into the interior than mere border surveys required. This was the moment when Percy Fawcett's fate was sealed, though he would not recognize it for years. Standing beside a smoldering fire in an abandoned indigenous village surrounded by jungle that stretched unbroken toward horizons no European had ever seen, he felt the first stirrings of the obsession that would ultimately consume him. Somewhere in that green immensity lay secrets that could transform human understanding of history, civilization, and the possibilities of human achievement. The lost city he would later call Zaid was already calling to him, though he did not yet know its name. The border survey that followed consumed 18 months of Fawcett's life and established his reputation as one of the world's most capable jungle explorers. Working with instruments that had to be protected from constant humidity while maintaining precision to within seconds of arc, he fixed the positions of landmarks that would anchor diplomatic negotiations for decades. His maps transformed speculative boundaries into mathematical certainties, rivers that existed only as indigenous names into precisely plotted waterways, and mountains that appeared as vague rumors into surveyed elevations. But the technical achievements of the survey paled beside Fawcett's growing comprehension of what the Amazon contained. Every week brought encounters with indigenous groups whose sophistication challenged European assumptions about primitive peoples. He met leaders who spoke multiple languages, navigated by stellar observations, and possessed detailed knowledge of geographic features hundreds of miles from their home territories. Their oral histories contained accounts of cities, confederations, and migrations that implied civilizations of continental scope. The Kalapalo people, encountered near the headwaters of the Xingu River, proved particularly knowledgeable about the interior regions. Their territory served as a crossroads for trade routes that connected distant tribal groups, and their leaders possessed information about waterways, settlements, and natural resources that existed nowhere in European records. Through careful questioning, mediated by hand gestures and the few Portuguese words some Kalapalo had learned from previous contact, Fawcett began assembling a mental map of a region far more complex than any European had imagined. The Kalapalo described settlements to the northeast that covered areas measured in days of travel rather than hours. They spoke of stone constructions, raised fields that could feed thousands of people, and earthworks that diverted rivers to serve agricultural and defensive purposes. Most intriguingly, they possessed artifacts, pottery shards, stone tools, and metal ornaments that suggested technological capabilities European observers had never documented in Amazonian peoples. Fawcett's request to examine these artifacts created the first serious tension within his expedition. Dr. Barros warned that pressing indigenous peoples for information they were reluctant to share could transform friendly relations into hostile ones with lethal speed. The military engineers dismissed indigenous accounts as fantasy, arguing that savages invariably exaggerated the achievements of their ancestors to impress European visitors. They urged Fawcett to complete his surveying assignment and return to civilization before the onset of the rainy season made travel impossible. But Fawcett had developed an intuition about indigenous truthfulness that would shape the rest of his life. These were people whose survival depended on accurate knowledge of their environment. Their descriptions of distant places had to be reliable, or travelers who depended on such information would die. When Kalapalo leaders described settlements that required days to cross, they were providing intelligence as precise as any military reconnaissance. When they mentioned stone constructions, they were referring to architectural achievements that Europeans had simply never bothered to investigate. The rainy season, when it arrived in November 1907, provided Fawcett with his first experience of the Amazon's seasonal transformation. Rivers that had been fordable streams became torrents that carried away entire trees. Paths that had been difficult became impassable. The forest canopy, already dense enough to block most sunlight, became so thick with new growth that noon felt like dusk. Rain fell with tropical intensity for hours at a time, turning the forest floor into a swamp that challenged every step. Yet even this season revealed the jungle's hidden order. Indigenous peoples had developed techniques for surviving conditions that would kill European expeditions in days. They built elevated shelters that stayed dry above flood levels. They knew which plants provided nutrition when familiar foods became unavailable. They could start fires in conditions that left matches useless and navigate by landmarks that remained recognizable even when seasonal floods altered the landscape beyond recognition. Fawcett spent the rainy season immersed in these survival techniques, learning skills that would later enable him to penetrate regions no other European could reach. he mastered the art of smoking meat to prevent spoilage and perpetual humidity. He learned to identify edible plants that could sustain life when hunting proved impossible. Most crucially, he developed an understanding of indigenous decision-making that would later enable him to gain acceptance among peoples who killed other Europeans on sight. The seasonal rains also provided extended opportunities for conversation with indigenous peoples who had time to share their knowledge during months when travel was impossible. Around evening fires, sheltered from the incessant precipitation, Fawcett listened to oral histories that stretched back generations. These accounts contained information about population movements, territorial conflicts, and environmental changes that revealed the Amazon's deep human history. The stories that captured Fawcett's imagination most powerfully concerned a confederation of settlements that had once controlled vast territories in the interior. According to multiple indigenous sources, these settlements had been connected by raised roads that remained passable during flood seasons. They had supported populations large enough to field armies, construct monumental architecture, and maintain trade relationships across thousands of miles. Most remarkably, they had possessed knowledge of metalworking, astronomy, and agriculture that had enabled them to flourish in environments where European colonies consistently failed. This confederation, the stories suggested, had collapsed relatively recently within the span of oral memory rather than archaeological time. Some accounts attributed its destruction to epidemic diseases that had arrived with the first European contact. Others described internal conflicts that had fragmented a once unified political system. Still others suggested that environmental changes had made their agricultural techniques unsustainable, forcing abandonment of settlements that had existed for centuries. What remained consistent across all versions was the claim that physical evidence of these achievements still existed in remote locations. Ruined cities lay hidden beneath jungle growth. Raised fields could still be traced across landscapes that appeared completely wild. Most tantalizingly, some settlements might still be inhabited by peoples who had preserved the Confederation's knowledge and maintained its traditions in isolation. When the dry season returned in April 1908, allowing the resumption of active surveying, Fawcett found himself torn between completing his official assignment and investigating these indigenous accounts. His surveying work was nearly finished. The major landmarks had been fixed, the disputed territories mapped, and the documentation prepared for diplomatic review. A competent professional would complete the remaining technical tasks and return to England with a mission accomplished and a reputation enhanced. But Fawcett was discovering that competent professionalism was insufficient to satisfy the appetite for discovery that the jungle had awakened in him. The border survey had been merely the pretext that brought him into contact with a mystery of potentially enormous significance. Indigenous accounts described achievements that, if verified, would revolutionize European understanding of pre-Columbian civilizations. The greatest archaeological discoveries of his era might lie within reach of an explorer willing to venture beyond the comfortable boundaries of official assignments. The decision to extend his investigation came during an encounter with an indigenous leader whose knowledge seemed particularly detailed. Chief Tawari of the Yawalapiti people possessed information about interior regions that he claimed came from direct observation rather than hearsay. He described traveling for weeks through territories controlled by peoples who maintained settlements larger and more sophisticated than any European had documented. His accounts included specific details about architectural techniques, agricultural systems, and social organization that suggested first-hand familiarity rather than folklore. Most significantly, Chief Tawari offered to guide Fawcett to locations where evidence of these achievements remained visible. Stone constructions, he claimed, could be reached within a month of travel from their present position. Raised agricultural fields covered areas so extensive that their boundaries disappeared beyond the horizon. Most remarkably, some settlements might still be inhabited by peoples who had preserved ancient knowledge while avoiding contact with the outside world. The offer presented Fawcett with a choice that would define the remainder of his life. He could complete his border survey, return to England, and build a comfortable career on his demonstrated competence as a tropical surveyor. Alternatively, he could risk everything, his official assignment, his team's safety, and his own life, to investigate indigenous claims that might prove to be either the greatest archaeological discovery of the modern era or elaborate fantasies that would destroy his reputation and kill everyone foolish enough to follow him into unmapped territory. Fawcett's decision was never really in doubt. On May 15, 1908, he dispatched Dr. Barros with the completed border survey documentation and a letter to the Royal Geographical Society explaining that he was extending his investigation to explore matters of significant archaeological potential. The military engineers, unwilling to risk court-martial for abandoning their official duties, departed with Barros. Fawcett retained only his most trusted indigenous guides and a single British assistant, reducing his expedition to a size that could move quickly and live off the land indefinitely. The reconnaissance that followed lasted 4 months and took Fawcett deeper into the Amazon than any previous European expedition had ventured. Guided by Chief Towary and traveling primarily by canoe along river systems that existed on no European map, the reduced expedition penetrated regions where the forest canopy was so dense that they sometimes traveled for days without seeing direct sunlight. The evidence they discovered exceeded Fawcett's most optimistic expectations. In the Mato Grosso region, they found raised causeways that stretched for miles across seasonal floodplains. These constructions demonstrated engineering sophistication that rivaled Roman road building, with carefully graded surfaces, drainage systems, and bridge foundations that had survived centuries of tropical weather. The labor force required for such projects implied populations far larger than European observers had ever documented in the Amazon. More remarkably, they discovered areas where the forest itself showed clear evidence of human management. What appeared to be pristine wilderness revealed, upon closer examination, to be an anthropogenic landscape shaped by centuries of indigenous intervention. Certain tree species had been planted in patterns that optimized their productivity. Groves of useful palms grew in locations that suggested deliberate cultivation rather than natural distribution. Even the soil showed chemical signatures that indicated intensive agricultural use in the recent past. The architectural discoveries were the most spectacular. Hidden beneath decades of jungle growth, they found stone foundations that outlined structures of substantial size and complexity. The construction techniques included fitted stone blocks, engineered drainage systems, and architectural features that suggested both practical and ceremonial functions. Some foundations were extensive enough to have supported buildings that housed hundreds of people. Others showed evidence of specialized construction that implied knowledge of astronomy, hydraulics, and other technical disciplines. But the most tantalizing discovery was also the most frustrating. At several locations, they found evidence of recent human activity. Cleared areas, fresh tool marks, and temporary shelters that suggested the presence of indigenous peoples who were actively avoiding contact with outsiders. These ghost inhabitants remained invisible despite weeks of patient investigation, leaving only traces that confirmed their existence while revealing nothing about their identity, their numbers, or their intentions. Chief Towari's explanations for this elusiveness proved both reassuring and disturbing. The peoples who maintained these hidden settlements, he claimed, were survivors of the ancient confederation, who had preserved their ancestors' knowledge while developing extraordinary skills at avoiding detection. They observed strangers from concealment, gathered intelligence about outsiders' intentions, and made carefully calculated decisions about whether to reveal themselves or remain hidden. Their default assumption, Chief Towari explained, was that contact with outsiders brought only disease, violence, and cultural destruction. The history of European indigenous relations in the Amazon provided ample justification for such assumptions. Rubber tappers had enslaved entire communities. Missionaries had suppressed traditional practices in the name of salvation. Government officials had imposed taxation and labor obligations that destroyed subsistence economies. The peoples of the interior had learned that isolation was the price of survival. Yet according to Chief Towari, these hidden communities maintained detailed knowledge about the outside world through networks of communication that connected isolated settlements across vast distances. They knew about European technology, understood the political forces that drove exploration and colonization, and possessed surprisingly accurate intelligence about specific expeditions and their purposes. Their decision to remain hidden was not based on ignorance, but on informed calculation about the costs and benefits of contact. This intelligence network also meant that news of Fawcett's expedition was spreading through indigenous communities far beyond the areas he had actually visited. His reputation as an explorer who treated indigenous peoples with respect had preceded him into regions he had never seen. Some communities were extending cautious hospitality based on recommendations from groups he had encountered months earlier. Others were taking defensive precautions against an outsider whose ultimate intentions remained unclear despite his apparently peaceful approach. The psychological impact of these discoveries on Fawcett was profound and permanent. He had entered the Amazon as a professional surveyor completing a routine assignment. He emerged as a man possessed by visions of archaeological treasures that could transform human understanding of pre-Columbian civilizations. The evidence he had collected proved that sophisticated indigenous societies had once flourished in regions that Europeans considered uninhabitable. The tantalizingly incomplete nature of that evidence suggested that far greater discoveries awaited explorers willing to invest the time and resources necessary for systematic investigation. But Fawcett's 4-month reconnaissance had also demonstrated the enormous challenges involved in such investigation. The hidden settlements existed in regions that were weeks of travel from the nearest European outpost. Reaching them required indigenous guides whose loyalty could not be purchased, but had to be earned through demonstrated respect and reciprocal benefit. The peoples who possessed the most valuable information were also the most suspicious of outsiders, requiring approaches so gradual and patient that they could consume years rather than months. Most importantly, Fawcett had learned that the greatest discoveries would require abandoning European assumptions about exploration methodology. Large expeditions with extensive supplies and modern equipment were viewed as threats by indigenous peoples who had learned to associate such displays of force with subsequent oppression. Small expeditions that could live off the land and adapt to indigenous customs were more likely to gain acceptance, but they were also more vulnerable to the countless dangers that made the Amazon a graveyard for inadequately prepared explorers. The recognition that future investigation would require expeditions of unprecedented duration and risk created a conflict between Fawcett's professional obligations and his personal obsessions. He was a serving military officer with a family in England and official duties that could not be abandoned indefinitely. Yet the archaeological opportunities he had discovered demanded the kind of long-term commitment that was incompatible with conventional career advancement. He faced a choice between the security of professional success and the possibility of achievements that would guarantee him immortal fame, or an anonymous death in unmapped territory. When Fawcett's expedition finally emerged from the jungle in September 1908, he carried documentation that established him as one of the world's leading experts on Amazonian exploration. His border survey had been completed with unprecedented accuracy. His maps filled in blank spaces that had frustrated cartographers for decades. His reports contained ethnographic observations that advanced European understanding of indigenous cultures. The Royal Geographical Society received him as a hero whose achievements vindicated their confidence in his abilities. But Fawcett also carried something more dangerous than professional success: an obsession with archaeological possibilities that made conventional achievement feel hollow. He had seen evidence of civilizations whose existence challenged fundamental assumptions about human capability and environmental limitation. He had stood on foundations that once supported buildings larger than most European churches. He had walked roads that once connected cities in a confederation that might have been the most sophisticated political system in pre-Columbian America. The fragments of evidence he had collected were sufficient to tantalize but insufficient to prove. Academic skeptics could dismiss his claims as misinterpretation of natural features or exaggeration of modest indigenous achievements. Without more extensive documentation, photographs, measurements, artifact collections, and systematic excavation, his discoveries would remain curiosities rather than scientific breakthroughs. Yet obtaining such documentation would require expeditions of unprecedented scope and danger. The hidden settlements lay in regions where European diseases had created hostility that could explode into violence without warning. The archaeological sites were often weeks of travel from navigable rivers, accessible only through territories controlled by indigenous groups whose political relationships were complex and unstable. Most challenging of all, the peoples who possessed the most detailed knowledge about these sites were the least willing to share that information with outsiders whose ultimate intentions remained suspect. During the months following his return to England, Fawcett wrestled with the implications of what he had discovered. His official reports, submitted to the Royal Geographical Society and the military authorities, described the archaeological evidence in measured terms that avoided claims that could not be definitively substantiated. His private correspondence, particularly his letters to Nina, revealed the full extent of his excitement and his growing determination to return to the Amazon for more systematic investigation. Nina Fawcett understood her husband's temperament well enough to recognize that his Amazon experiences had changed him permanently. The man who returned to England in late 1908 was physically unchanged, but psychologically transformed. His conversations revolved obsessively around the archaeological possibilities he had glimpsed. His plans for future expeditions consumed his attention to the exclusion of domestic concerns. Most tellingly, he spoke about the Amazon discoveries with the kind of passionate certainty that she had previously seen only when he discussed their marriage and their children. The parallel was not accidental. Fawcett had fallen in love with a mystery that offered the possibility of immortal achievement. Like all obsessive love, this passion was based partially on genuine appreciation of the beloved's qualities and partially on projections that revealed more about the lover than the object of affection. The archaeological evidence Fawcett had discovered was real and significant. His interpretation of that evidence as proof of a lost civilization waiting to be rediscovered was a leap of faith that said as much about his psychological needs as about his scientific judgment. By early 1909, Fawcett had made the decision that would define the remainder of his life. He would return to the Amazon, not as a military surveyor completing official assignments, but as an independent explorer seeking archaeological discoveries that could transform human understanding of pre-Columbian civilizations. The transition from professional competence to personal obsession was complete. Percy Harrison Fawcett had found his destiny, and it lay hidden somewhere in the green immensity of the Amazon basin, waiting to destroy him or make him immortal. The transformation from military officer to obsessed explorer required sacrifices that would have broken lesser men. Fawcett resigned his commission in 1910, abandoning the security of army pay and the clear hierarchy of military advancement for the uncertain rewards of independent exploration. At 43, with 3 children and a wife who deserved stability, he chose instead the precarious existence of a freelance adventurer whose income would depend on lecture fees, book sales, and the grudging support of geographical societies that preferred their explorers to die romantically rather than return with expensive demands for future funding. Nina bore this transformation with the stoic grace of a woman who understood that attempting to cage a force of nature would destroy both the cage and its intended occupant. She became the expedition's home base, managing correspondence with potential sponsors, maintaining relationships with scientific institutions, and raising their children with stories that made their father's absence seem heroic rather than abandonment. Her letters to Percy during his subsequent expeditions reveal a woman of extraordinary strength, offering emotional support while suppressing her own fears about the growing extremity of his obsession. The Royal Geographical Society's response to Fawcett's proposal for a purely archaeological expedition was cautiously supportive but financially inadequate. They recognized the scientific potential of his discoveries but balked at funding expeditions whose success could not be guaranteed and whose failure would reflect poorly on their judgment. The compromise they offered, minimal funding supplemented by requirements that Fawcett combine archaeological investigation with continued surveying work, forced him to design expeditions that served multiple purposes while adequately supporting none. This financial constraint would plague every subsequent expedition, creating a cycle of compromise that ultimately contributed to Fawcett's destruction. Each journey into the Amazon required months of preparation. Yet inadequate funding meant that preparation was always rushed and equipment was always insufficient. Each expedition uncovered evidence that demanded follow-up investigation, yet financial limitations forced premature returns that left crucial questions unanswered. Most dangerously, the pressure to produce immediate results encouraged increasingly risky decisions as Fawcett pushed deeper into unmapped territory with smaller teams and fewer supplies. His second major expedition, launched in 1911, demonstrated both the promise and the perils of this approach. The official objective was to survey the Rio Verde, completing maps that would support Brazilian government planning for potential railroad construction. The unofficial objective was to investigate indigenous accounts of stone cities located several weeks' travel northeast of his previous discoveries. The expedition budget was sufficient for the surveying work, but inadequate for extended archaeological investigation, forcing Fawcett to gamble that he could accomplish both missions within the time and resources allocated. The team that departed from Cuiabá in May 1911 was smaller and more carefully selected than his previous expeditions. Fawcett had learned that compatibility was more important than competence when men would be isolated together for months, in conditions that tested every aspect of character. His companions included Henry Coston, a British corporal whose loyalty and competence had been proven during the border survey, and Aniceto, a Brazilian guide whose knowledge of indigenous languages and customs was encyclopedic. More significantly, this expedition marked the first appearance of indigenous advisors who would play crucial roles in all of Fawcett's subsequent journeys. Chief Bernardino of the Bororo people had become fascinated by European technology while maintaining deep knowledge of traditional territories and tribal relationships. His ability to serve as cultural interpreter between European and indigenous worldviews made him invaluable to an explorer whose success depended on gaining acceptance among peoples who had every reason to distrust outsiders. The Rio Verde survey consumed the first 3 months of the expedition and revealed landscape features that supported indigenous accounts of extensive ancient settlements. Raised earthworks extended for miles across areas that appeared to be pristine wilderness. Artificial mounds marked locations where substantial structures had once stood. Most remarkably, they discovered evidence of sophisticated water management systems, canals, reservoirs, and flood control structures that had enabled agricultural productivity in areas that modern techniques considered unsuitable for intensive cultivation. But the archaeological investigation that followed the surveying work produced discoveries that exceeded anything Fawcett had previously encountered. Guided by Chief Bernardino through territories that existed on no European map, they reached locations where indigenous oral history claimed the greatest cities had once stood. The evidence they found there would haunt Fawcett for the remainder of his life and ultimately drive him to seek something that might have existed only in his increasingly fevered imagination. The first indication that they were approaching something extraordinary came from changes in the forest itself. Chief Bernardino pointed out subtle signs that most Europeans would have missed. Patterns in tree distribution that suggested human intervention, soil conditions that indicated previous cultivation, and artificial features that had been incorporated so skillfully into the natural landscape that they appeared to be geological formations. This was not pristine wilderness, but an anthropogenic environment where centuries of human activity had shaped every aspect of the ecosystem. The stone foundations they discovered in this carefully modified landscape were unlike anything previously documented in the Amazon. Instead of the modest platforms and ceremonial structures typical of indigenous architecture, they found evidence of buildings that had been designed for permanent occupation by large populations. Foundation stones showed tool marks that indicated sophisticated masonry techniques. Drainage systems demonstrated engineering knowledge that rivaled Roman hydraulic works. Most significantly, the scale of construction implied organizational capabilities that contradicted every European assumption about indigenous social development. Fawcett's descriptions of these discoveries, preserved in letters to Nina and in reports to the Royal Geographical Society, reveal a man struggling to convey the significance of evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about pre-Columbian civilizations. The ruins were extensive enough to suggest cities rather than villages. The construction techniques were sophisticated enough to indicate knowledge that Europeans had assumed was unique to classical Mediterranean civilizations. The preservation was sufficient to allow detailed measurement and documentation. Yet the sites remained hidden beneath jungle growth that would conceal them from casual observation. But the most tantalizing discovery was also the most frustrating. At several locations, they found evidence that the ruins had been visited recently by peoples who left no other traces of their presence. Stone blocks had been cleared of vegetation. Drainage channels had been maintained in working condition. Most mysteriously, some areas showed signs of careful preservation, as though invisible guardians were protecting these ancient sites from the jungle's inexorable encroachment. Chief Bernardino's explanations for this maintenance proved both enlightening and alarming. According to his sources, the ruins were considered sacred by indigenous peoples who maintained them as monuments to their ancestors' achievements. These guardian communities lived in carefully concealed settlements and emerged only to perform ritual obligations that kept the ancient sites from disappearing beneath jungle growth. Their presence meant that Fawcett's expedition was being observed by peoples whose intentions were unknown and whose capabilities were considerable. The implications of this revelation were profound. If indigenous communities were actively preserving these ruins, they possessed detailed knowledge about the civilizations that had built them. Their oral histories might contain information that could illuminate the political, religious, and technological systems that had created these architectural achievements. Most importantly, they might know the locations of sites that were even more impressive than the ruins Fawcett had already discovered. Yet approaching these guardian communities would require diplomatic skills that went far beyond Fawcett's previous experience with indigenous peoples. These were not isolated groups struggling for survival, but organized societies with sophisticated understanding of their own history and clear policies about contact with outsiders. Their decision to remain hidden suggested that they had concluded that such contact brought more costs than benefits. Gaining their trust would require patience, respect, and reciprocal benefits that Fawcett might not be able to provide. The psychological impact of these discoveries on Fawcett was immediate and permanent. He had found evidence of indigenous civilizations whose achievements rivaled those of classical antiquity. He had confirmed that sophisticated archaeological sites remained hidden throughout the Amazon, waiting for systematic investigation by explorers with adequate time and resources. Most significantly, he had learned that indigenous peoples maintained detailed knowledge about these sites and might be willing to share that knowledge with outsiders who approached them appropriately. Yet the expedition's financial constraints and time limitations prevented the kind of extensive investigation that these discoveries demanded. Fawcett spent only 3 weeks documenting ruins that deserved months of careful excavation. He made contact with only a handful of indigenous groups who possessed knowledge that could guide years of archaeological research. Most frustratingly, he barely glimpsed the network of preserved sites that Chief Bernardino claimed extended across hundreds of miles of unmapped territory. When the expedition returned to Cuiabá in December 1911, Fawcett carried documentation that established him as the discoverer of pre-Columbian civilizations of unprecedented sophistication. His photographs showed architectural features that challenged every assumption about indigenous capabilities. His measurements proved that these were not modest ceremonial centers, but urban complexes designed to support substantial populations. His maps identified locations where future expeditions could conduct systematic archaeological investigation. But Fawcett also carried something more dangerous than professional triumph: absolute conviction that far greater discoveries awaited explorers willing to venture deeper into the interior than any European had previously traveled. Chief Bernardino's accounts suggested that the ruins they had documented were merely peripheral settlements compared to ceremonial and administrative centers that lay weeks of travel beyond the reach of conventional expeditions. Indigenous oral history described cities of stone and gold that had served as capitals for confederations spanning thousands of miles of Amazonian territory. The specific city that would ultimately destroy Fawcett first entered his imagination during conversations with Chief Bernardino around evening campfires during the return journey. The Bororo leader described a settlement that his people called by a name that Fawcett's linguistic abilities could not quite capture, a place where stone buildings reached toward the sky, where gold was so common that it was used for everyday utensils, and where knowledge was preserved in forms that allowed it to survive across generations. This city, according to Chief Bernardino, lay in a region so remote that reaching it required crossing territories controlled by indigenous groups who killed strangers on sight. Fawcett would later call this place simply Zed, a designation that reflected both his inability to pronounce its indigenous name and his growing tendency to mythologize discoveries that existed primarily in his imagination. The letter Zed carried connotations of finality and mystery that perfectly captured Fawcett's sense that this city represented the ultimate achievement of pre-Columbian civilization and the ultimate challenge for modern exploration. Finding Z would prove that indigenous peoples had created urban centers rivaling anything in Europe. Failing to find it would suggest that the greatest archaeological discoveries of his era lay forever beyond reach. The lectures Fawcett delivered in England during 1912 and 1913 established his reputation as one of the world's leading authorities on Amazonian archaeology while simultaneously feeding the obsession that would eventually destroy him. Audiences at the Royal Geographical Society listened with fascination as he described ruins that challenged fundamental assumptions about indigenous capabilities. His photographs and artifacts provided tangible evidence of civilizations whose existence had been dismissed as fantasy by previous generations of scholars. Yet the reception of his discoveries also revealed the institutional constraints that would frustrate all of his subsequent efforts. Academic archaeologists praised his fieldwork while questioning his interpretations. They acknowledged that he had found impressive ruins while disputing his claims about their significance. Most damagingly, they argued that systematic excavation would be required to substantiate conclusions that Fawcett had reached through reconnaissance alone. This academic skepticism created a professional trap from which Fawcett could never escape. His discoveries were spectacular enough to establish his reputation, but incomplete enough to invite criticism from scholars who had never endured the hardships of Amazonian fieldwork. Proving his claims would require expeditions of unprecedented duration and expense, yet securing funding for such expeditions required evidence that could only be obtained through the kind of systematic investigation that his critics demanded. The solution Fawcett developed to this dilemma would ultimately prove fatal. Since academic institutions were unwilling to fund expeditions adequate to his archaeological ambitions, he would seek alternative sources of support that came with fewer scholarly constraints, but greater personal risks. Newspaper editors were fascinated by stories of lost cities and willing to pay substantial fees for exclusive accounts of their discovery. Wealthy adventurers were eager to fund expeditions that might make them famous as patrons of epoch-making discoveries. Popular magazines created markets for exploration narratives that emphasized drama over scientific rigor. These alternative funding sources allowed Fawcett to plan expeditions that were larger and more ambitious than anything the Royal Geographical Society would support. But they also created pressures that encouraged increasingly reckless decisions. Newspaper editors wanted dramatic stories that could capture public attention, not careful documentation of modest archaeological finds. Wealthy patrons expected spectacular discoveries that would justify their investment and enhance their reputations. Popular magazines demanded narratives with clear heroes, villains, and triumphant conclusions rather than the ambiguous outcomes typical of serious scientific research. Most dangerously, these commercial pressures encouraged Fawcett to present his hypotheses as established facts and his speculations as documented discoveries. The lost city he called Zed gradually transformed in his public presentations from a possible archaeological site suggested by indigenous accounts into a definite location that awaited only adequate funding to be reached and documented. The evidence for extensive pre-Columbian civilizations evolved from intriguing but incomplete archaeological finds into proof of urban centers that had rivaled ancient Rome in their sophistication. This rhetorical inflation served Fawcett's immediate needs by generating the publicity and funding necessary for return expeditions, but it also created expectations that no actual discovery could satisfy and committed him to claims that could only be validated by achievements that might be impossible. The real cities he had found were impressive by any objective standard, but they could never match the legendary metropolis that his promotional activities had promised to reveal. The expedition he launched in 1914 demonstrated both the possibilities and the perils of this commercially funded approach to exploration. With financial backing from a consortium of British investors and exclusive reporting agreements with several newspapers, Fawcett was able to assemble the most ambitious expedition of his career. The team included professional surveyors, a photographer capable of producing images suitable for popular publication, and enough supplies to support extended investigation of archaeological sites without the pressure for premature return that had limited his previous expeditions. Yet the expedition's commercial obligations also created problems that Fawcett had not anticipated. Newspaper editors expected regular reports that could be published while public interest remained high. Investors demanded evidence that their money was producing discoveries worthy of international attention. The photographer's priority was capturing dramatic images that would reproduce effectively in popular publications rather than documenting archaeological details with scientific precision. These pressures encouraged decisions that violated every principle of safe exploration that Fawcett had learned during his previous expeditions. The expedition was too large to move quickly through territories where indigenous peoples might be hostile. The supply requirements were too extensive to allow the kind of adaptation to local conditions that had enabled Fawcett's previous successes. Most dangerously, the need to produce commercially viable results created pressure to take risks that prudent exploration would avoid. The disaster that followed was as predictable as it was preventable. Deep in the Mato Grosso region, the expedition encountered indigenous peoples who interpreted the large European presence as a threat requiring immediate response. The attack, when it came, was coordinated and overwhelming. Half the expedition died in the initial assault. The survivors, scattered and demoralized, were forced to abandon most of their equipment and flee through jungle that offered no safety and no clear route to civilization. Fawcett's survival during the subsequent 3 months of desperate retreat demonstrated the individual skills that had made his reputation, while revealing the leadership failures that would ultimately destroy him. His ability to find food, navigate without instruments, and endure hardship that killed other men enabled him to guide the surviving expedition members through terrain that should have been their collective grave. Yet his decisions during the crisis, particularly his insistence on continuing archaeological investigation even while under attack, showed that his judgment had been compromised by obsessions that took precedence over basic survival. When the remnants of the expedition finally reached a Brazilian trading post in September 1914, Fawcett faced a professional crisis that would have ended most explorers' careers. Half his team was dead. His expensive equipment was lost. His promised discoveries had not materialized. The commercial backers who had funded the expedition were demanding explanations that Fawcett could not provide, without admitting that his leadership had been catastrophically flawed. Yet instead of accepting responsibility for the disaster, Fawcett interpreted the expedition's failure as evidence that he had been approaching the greatest discovery of his career when hostile forces had prevented its completion. The indigenous attack, he claimed, proved that his expedition had been approaching sites so significant that their guardians were willing to risk war to protect them. The equipment losses were temporary setbacks rather than permanent failures. The deaths of his colleagues were tragic sacrifices in pursuit of archaeological achievements that would transform human understanding of pre-Columbian civilizations. This interpretation allowed Fawcett to maintain his psychological equilibrium while planning future expeditions, but it also marked his transition from rational exploration to obsessive pursuit of goals that existed primarily in his imagination. The archaeological evidence he had discovered during his successful expeditions was real and significant. The lost city he called Zed was increasingly becoming a psychological projection that revealed more about his emotional needs than about Amazonian archaeology. The outbreak of the Great War in August 1914 provided temporary respite from the pressures of planning impossible expeditions while offering Fawcett opportunities to demonstrate competence in conventional military operations. His recall to active duty took him to the Western Front, where his surveying skills and leadership experience proved valuable for artillery spotting and trench mapping. The transition from Amazonian exploration to European warfare was jarring but psychologically beneficial, providing external validation of abilities that his recent expedition failures had called into question. Yet even military service could not cure Fawcett's obsession with archaeological discoveries that remained tantalizingly beyond reach. His letters to Nina during the war years reveal a man whose thoughts returned compulsively to the Amazon despite immediate responsibilities that demanded complete attention. He spent leave periods studying indigenous languages, corresponding with anthropologists, and planning expeditions that would resume immediately upon his release from military obligations. The war also provided Fawcett with a new understanding of what might be required to achieve his archaeological ambitions. The massive industrial mobilization necessary for modern warfare demonstrated that extraordinary achievements required extraordinary commitments of resources, personnel, and time. The sacrifices that nations were making for geopolitical objectives suggested that comparable investments might be justified for archaeological discoveries that could transform human knowledge. Most significantly, the war's terrible casualties normalized levels of risk and loss that would have seemed unacceptable during peacetime. If entire generations could be sacrificed for political objectives, then the death of individual explorers in pursuit of scientific knowledge appeared almost modest by comparison. The psychological barriers that had previously constrained Fawcett's willingness to accept extreme danger were being eroded by daily exposure to carnage that made Amazonian exploration seem relatively safe. When Fawcett returned to civilian life in 1919, he was 52 years old and aware that time was running out for expeditions that demanded peak physical condition. His body had been weakened by 4 years of warfare. His financial resources had been exhausted by military service, and his family obligations had increased during his absence, yet his obsession with finding the lost city he called Z had only intensified during the war years, fed by isolation and frustration that made the Amazon's mysteries seem more alluring than European civilization's complexities. The expedition he began planning in 1920 would be his last serious attempt to achieve the archaeological discoveries that had dominated his imagination for more than a decade. It would also be the expedition that killed him, though death would come not from the jungle's familiar dangers but from his growing inability to distinguish between rational exploration and obsessive pursuit of goals that existed primarily in his fevered imagination. The lost city of Z was calling to him with a voice that had become impossible to resist. Percy Harrison Fawcett was about to answer that call with his life. The post-war world offered Fawcett opportunities that had been unimaginable before 1914. The Great War had shattered old certainties about European civilization's superiority, creating public appetite for discoveries that might reveal alternative paths of human development. Popular interest in archaeology had been heightened by spectacular finds in Egypt and Mesopotamia, making lost cities commercially viable subjects for books, lectures, and newspaper serialization. Most importantly, technological advances promised to make Amazonian exploration less lethal than it had been during Fawcett's earlier expeditions. Radio communication could maintain contact with civilization across distances that had previously meant complete isolation. Improved medicines offered protection against tropical diseases that had killed countless previous explorers. Better maps, based partly on Fawcett's own surveying work, reduced the navigational uncertainties that had contributed to so many expedition disasters. For the first time in his career, Fawcett could plan an expedition that combined unprecedented ambition with reasonable prospects of success. Yet the same technological optimism that made ambitious exploration seem feasible also created pressures that would prove fatal to rational decision-making. Radio communication meant that expedition progress could be monitored by anxious sponsors and impatient newspaper editors who had no understanding of jungle realities. Medical advances encouraged overconfidence about health risks that remained fundamentally unchanged despite improved treatment options. Better maps provided detailed knowledge of peripheral regions while revealing the vast extent of territories that remained completely unmapped. The financial backing Fawcett secured for his final expedition reflected both the opportunities and the constraints of post-war exploration funding. A consortium of British and American investors agreed to support an expedition lasting up to 2 years, with provisions for extending the timeline if discoveries justified additional investment. Newspaper syndication rights provided substantial upfront payments in exchange for exclusive reporting privileges. Book and lecture contracts promised long-term income that could support Fawcett's family during his absence and provide financial security upon his return. But these funding arrangements also created obligations that would ultimately prove incompatible with prudent exploration. The investors expected discoveries spectacular enough to generate public excitement and commercial returns. The newspaper contracts required regular reports that could maintain reader interest across months of expedition progress. The book publishers demanded narratives with dramatic tension and triumphant conclusions rather than the ambiguous outcomes typical of serious archaeological research. Most dangerously, these commercial pressures encouraged Fawcett to make promises about expedition outcomes that could only be fulfilled by achievements that bordered on the miraculous. His promotional materials described Z as a definite location that awaited only adequate funding and determination to be reached and documented. His contract specified discovery of major archaeological sites as measurable objectives rather than hopeful possibilities. His public statements committed him to returning with evidence that would revolutionize European understanding of pre-Columbian civilizations. The expedition team Fawcett assembled for this final journey reflected both his accumulated wisdom about Amazonian exploration and his growing detachment from practical reality. His core companions would be his son Jack, now 21 and eager to prove himself worthy of his father's reputation, and Jack's closest friend Raleigh Ramel, whose Oxford education had prepared him for everything except the realities of jungle survival. Jack Fawcett had grown up hearing stories of his father's adventures that transformed brutal hardship into romantic adventure. His childhood had been shaped by maps that marked unexplored territories, artifacts that proved indigenous sophistication, and letters that described archaeological discoveries awaiting future investigation. For a young man seeking identity and purpose in a world still recovering from catastrophic warfare, the prospect of sharing his father's greatest adventure offered meaning that conventional career paths could never provide. Yet Jack's preparation for Amazonian exploration had been entirely theoretical. He possessed physical strength and intellectual curiosity, but he had never experienced the kind of prolonged hardship that made jungle survival possible. His romantic vision of exploration emphasized discovery and adventure, while minimizing the disease, exhaustion, and constant proximity to death that characterized actual expeditions. Most dangerously, his filial loyalty made him incapable of questioning his father's judgment, even when that judgment was becoming increasingly detached from reality. Raleigh Ramel's participation in the expedition revealed Fawcett's growing inability to assess character accurately when making decisions that would determine life and death outcomes. Ramel was intelligent, enthusiastic, and physically capable, but he possessed no relevant experience and had demonstrated no particular aptitude for the kind of sustained hardship that Amazonian exploration required. His inclusion in the expedition team was based primarily on Jack's friendship rather than careful evaluation of his qualifications for one of history's most challenging expeditions. The decision to limit the expedition to just 3 men represented Fawcett's most significant tactical error, born from lessons learned during his previous expeditions but applied without adequate consideration of changed circumstances. His successful journeys had indeed been conducted with small teams that could move quickly and adapt to indigenous customs without presenting obvious threats. But those expeditions had been reconnaissance missions designed to gather information rather than archaeological investigations requiring extended stays in remote locations. The search for Zed would demand weeks or months of systematic excavation in regions where indigenous peoples might be hostile. Small expedition teams had succeeded when their objective was mapping boundaries or establishing initial contact with indigenous groups. They were inadequately sized for archaeological work that required simultaneous attention to scientific documentation, diplomatic relations with local peoples, and basic survival in environments that challenged every aspect of human endurance. Fawcett's correspondence during the months preceding departure reveals a man whose grip on practical reality was loosening under the pressure of expectations he had created through years of increasingly extravagant claims. His letters to Nina describe Zed as though its location and characteristics were established facts rather than hypotheses based on fragmentary evidence. His communications with expedition sponsors promised discoveries whose significance would justify any level of investment or risk. Most tellingly, his planning documents assumed success at every stage of an enterprise whose complexity made failure almost inevitable. The route Fawcett planned for reaching Zede reflected both his accumulated knowledge of Amazonian geography and his growing tendency to ignore obstacles that interfered with his preferred narrative. The expedition would begin from Cuiabá, the Brazilian frontier town that had served as starting point for his previous journeys. From there, they would travel northeast through regions he had explored during earlier expeditions, gathering indigenous guides and confirming directions to the lost city that increasingly existed more in his imagination than in any verifiable location. The indigenous sources Fawcett claimed to have consulted about Zede's location were becoming increasingly vague in his accounts, suggesting either that his memory was becoming unreliable or that the evidence for the city's existence was weaker than he was willing to admit. Earlier expedition reports had identified specific tribal leaders who possessed detailed knowledge about archaeological sites. His final expedition plans referenced conversations and informants that became more mythical with each retelling. Most significantly, Fawcett's route planning ignored logistical realities that had constrained all of his previous expeditions. The proposed journey would take the team through territories where indigenous peoples had demonstrated consistent hostility toward European intruders. The distances involved exceeded anything he had previously attempted with such minimal personnel and supplies. The timeline assumed travel speeds and archaeological productivity that had never been achieved during actual expeditions rather than theoretical planning sessions. The supplies Fawcett selected for the expedition revealed the same mixture of hard-won experience and dangerous overconfidence that characterized his personnel decisions. His equipment list included innovations that reflected lessons learned during previous expeditions: lightweight camping gear, medical supplies chosen for tropical effectiveness, and trade goods selected based on demonstrated indigenous preferences. Yet the total supply weight was inadequate for an expedition of the projected duration, and critical categories of equipment were eliminated to reduce the burden on an expedition team too small to carry adequate provisions. The decision to travel without radio communication equipment represented Fawcett's most fateful choice, though it appeared logical based on his previous expedition experience. Radio gear in 1925 was heavy, unreliable, and dependent on atmospheric conditions that made communication impossible during much of the year in tropical regions. Every pound of radio equipment meant reducing food, medicine, or scientific instruments that might prove more valuable for expedition success. Yet radio communication was the only means by which rescue expeditions could be coordinated if the primary expedition encountered difficulties. Fawcett's previous expeditions had survived disasters through his individual survival skills and the loyalty of indigenous guides who could navigate towards civilization when European navigation failed. The search for Zede would take the expedition into regions where even friendly indigenous peoples might be unable to provide guidance toward known European settlements. The public departure ceremonies in London and Rio de Janeiro transformed what should have been careful preparation for a dangerous expedition into promotional events designed to maintain commercial interest in discoveries that had not yet occurred. Fawcett found himself committed to expedition outcomes through contracts and public statements that eliminated the flexibility necessary for adapting to changed circumstances or unexpected obstacles. The pressure to produce commercially viable results was evident in Fawcett's final interviews before departure. He described Zede with confidence that suggested personal familiarity rather than informed speculation. He estimated expedition timelines with precision that ignored the unpredictability of jungle travel. Most dangerously, he dismissed concerns about expedition safety with assurances based more on promotional necessity than realistic assessment of risks involved in attempting discoveries that had eluded every previous explorer. When the expedition finally departed from Cuiabá on April 20th, 1925, Fawcett carried with him the accumulated hopes, expectations, and financial investments of people who had believed his promises about archaeological discoveries that would justify any risk or cost. The three men who walked into the jungle that morning, Percy at 57, Jack at 21, and Raleigh at 22, represented different generations' understanding of exploration's possibilities and perils. Percy carried the burden of a reputation built on genuine achievements, but sustained through increasingly extravagant promises. His body bore the accumulated damage of decades of tropical exploration, yet his mind remained focused on discoveries that could provide the immortal fame he had sought since youth. Jack carried the enthusiasm of inexperience and the weight of expectations created by growing up as the son of a legendary explorer. Raleigh carried the educated curiosity of his generation and the tragic naivety of someone who understood adventure only through books rather than bitter experience. The early stages of their journey retraced routes Fawcett had traveled during previous expeditions, providing false confidence that masked the unprecedented nature of what they were attempting. The indigenous peoples they encountered during the first weeks recognized Fawcett from his earlier visits and extended hospitality based on established relationships rather than evaluation of current expedition goals. This familiar reception concealed the fact that their ultimate destination lay far beyond regions where Fawcett's reputation provided any protection. The letters Fawcett wrote to Nina during these early weeks reveal a man whose optimism remained intact despite growing evidence that the expedition was encountering difficulties that previous experience had not prepared him to handle. His communications described steady progress toward objectives that remained vaguely defined and indigenous cooperation that was becoming increasingly reluctant as the expedition's true ambitions became apparent to their guides and hosts. The Kalapalo people, encountered in late May 1925, represented the expedition's last contact with indigenous groups that maintained regular communication with Brazilian authorities. Chief Aloique, who had known Fawcett during his earlier expeditions, provided guidance that would later prove crucial for understanding what happened to the three explorers. But the chief's warnings about the dangers that lay ahead were dismissed by men whose commitment to their quest had passed beyond rational assessment of risks and benefits. According to later testimony from Chief Aloique and other Kalapalo witnesses, Fawcett's behavior during this final documented contact revealed a man whose judgment had been compromised by obsessions that took precedence over basic survival instincts. He insisted on continuing toward destinations that even experienced indigenous travelers considered suicidally dangerous. He ignored advice about seasonal conditions that would make travel impossible within weeks. Most ominously, he seemed to regard warnings about hostile indigenous peoples as confirmation that he was approaching discoveries so significant that their guardians were prepared to kill to protect them. The expedition's departure from the Kalapalo settlement on May 29, 1925, marked their transition from difficult but documented exploration into the realm of complete uncertainty. Chief Aloique watched them disappear into jungle that stretched unbroken toward horizons no European had ever seen, carrying minimal supplies toward destinations that existed primarily in Fawcett's increasingly fevered imagination. What followed was the greatest mystery in exploration history. 3 men walked into the Amazon rainforest and vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed them whole. No trace of their passage, no evidence of their fate, no word from any member of the expedition would ever reach civilization. They had entered a green void from which nothing emerged except questions that would torment investigators for generations. The silence that settled over Fawcett's expedition created a vacuum that drew rescue attempts like iron filings toward a magnet. When months passed without communication, Nina Fawcett organized the first search expedition, funded by newspaper syndicates eager to resolve a mystery that was selling papers across 2 continents. When that expedition returned without findings, private adventurers launched independent searches funded by wealthy patrons who saw opportunity for fame in solving exploration's greatest puzzle. Each rescue attempt generated its own mysteries and tragedies. Expeditions disappeared while searching for the original missing explorers. Indigenous peoples, alarmed by the sudden increase in European intrusion, became hostile toward all outsiders. The jungle that had claimed 3 lives began claiming dozens, then scores, as the search for Percy Fawcett became a death trap that destroyed everyone who attempted it. The Brazilian government, embarrassed by their inability to locate a famous explorer who had disappeared within their territory, launched official search expeditions with military support and unlimited budgets. These well-equipped efforts achieved nothing except confirmation that the Amazon was vast enough to hide any number of missing expeditions and inhospitable enough to kill most of those sent to find them. Newspaper editors, faced with public fascination that showed no signs of diminishing, began funding increasingly exotic theories about Fawcett's fate. Had he been killed by hostile indigenous peoples defending ancient secrets? Had he discovered the lost city and chosen to remain there rather than return to civilization? Had he died of disease in some remote location where his body would never be found? Each theory spawned expeditions designed to test its validity, and each expedition added to the roster of people who had died trying to solve a mystery that was becoming more complex with every failed attempt at resolution. The most persistent theory, and the one that would prove most enduring, suggested that Fawcett had indeed found something extraordinary before meeting his fate. This interpretation transformed his disappearance from tragedy into romantic mystery, suggesting that he had achieved his life's ambition but had been prevented by circumstances beyond his control from sharing his discoveries with the world. The lost city of Zed became not just Fawcett's obsession, but his monument. A place that existed because he had died seeking it rather than because he had found it. Indigenous peoples throughout the region found themselves subjected to interrogation by Europeans convinced that tribal knowledge contained clues to Fawcett's location or fate. The Kalapalo, who had provided the expedition's last documented shelter, faced particular pressure to reveal information they might be concealing about what had happened to the famous explorer and his companions. Their consistent accounts of watching the expedition depart towards certain death were dismissed by investigators convinced that indigenous peoples were hiding evidence of murder or capture. The tragedy was compounding itself with every passing month. Fawcett's disappearance had created a legend that was consuming lives at an accelerating rate while generating no useful information about what had actually happened to the three men who had walked into the jungle with such confidence in their ability to succeed where others had failed. Years passed, then decades, and still the Amazon kept its secret. The search for Percy Fawcett had become exploration's greatest obsession, drawing adventurers, scientists, and fortune hunters into a green maze that yielded clues enough to sustain hope, but never sufficient evidence to provide answers. The jungle had swallowed three men so completely that their disappearance became more famous than any discovery they might have made, their fate more compelling than any archaeological treasure they might have found. The mystery of Z had achieved an immortality that its discoverer could never have anticipated. By failing to find his lost city, Percy Fawcett had created something even more enduring, a legend that would outlive everyone who had known him and continue calling to future generations of explorers who believed they could succeed where the master himself had failed. The Amazon had claimed its most famous victim, but the appetite for solving its greatest mystery showed no signs of diminishing. Percy Harrison Fawcett had become part of the jungle's mythology, a ghost whose presence could be sensed but never confirmed, whose story would be retold as long as there remained blank spaces on maps and human hearts capable of being stirred by tales of courage, obsession, and the terrible price of seeking knowledge that the world was not ready to receive. The search for Percy Fawcett became the 20th century's most obsessive manhunt, consuming lives and fortunes with the mechanical efficiency of an industrial process. Between 1925 and 1950, more than 100 people died attempting to solve the mystery of his disappearance. The Brazilian government estimated that search expeditions had cost more money than the original construction of the Trans-Amazonian Highway. Yet for all this expenditure of blood and treasure, the jungle yielded nothing more substantial than rumors, legends, and increasingly elaborate theories that revealed more about their creators than about the fate of three men who had simply walked into the forest and vanished. The first serious rescue attempt was organized by Nina Fawcett herself, a woman whose strength had sustained her husband's obsession and would now drive her own desperate search for answers. By December 1925, when 7 months had passed without word from Percy, she had assembled funding from newspaper syndicates and geographical societies for an expedition led by George Miller Dyatt, an American adventurer whose reputation for jungle survival nearly matched Fawcett's own. Dyatt's expedition represented everything Percy Fawcett had learned to avoid during his years of Amazonian exploration. The team was large, well-equipped, and heavily armed, moving through indigenous territories with the subtle grace of a military invasion. They carried radio equipment, modern weapons, medical supplies sufficient for a small hospital, and enough trade goods to purchase the cooperation of every indigenous group between Cuiabá and the Atlantic Ocean. Their approach embodied the technological optimism of the 1920s, the belief that superior equipment and overwhelming resources could solve problems that had defeated individual courage and survival skills. Yet for all their advantages, Dyatt's expedition discovered what every subsequent search would confirm. The Amazon was large enough to hide any number of missing explorers and complex enough to make systematic search impossible. The jungle contained thousands of possible routes, countless locations where men could die unobserved, and indigenous peoples whose knowledge of recent events was filtered through cultural assumptions that made European disappearances seem both predictable and unremarkable. The radio equipment that was supposed to provide Dyatt's expedition with decisive advantages over Fawcett's primitive communications proved useless in terrain, where atmospheric conditions made transmission impossible for weeks at a time. The superior medical supplies could treat tropical diseases, but could not prevent the exhaustion, accidents, and psychological breakdown that made jungle exploration dangerous, regardless of technological support. Most frustratingly, the overwhelming resources that should have enabled systematic search instead attracted attention from indigenous groups, who viewed large expeditions as threats requiring immediate response. Dyatt's encounters with the Kalapalo people provided the first detailed account of Fawcett's final documented activities, but the information only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Chief Alaweek and other tribal witnesses confirmed that Fawcett, Jack, and Raleigh had departed their settlement on May 29, 1925, traveling northeast toward regions the Kalapalo considered extremely dangerous. The three men had appeared to be in good health, adequately supplied and confident about their prospects for success, but the Kalapalo accounts also revealed troubling details about Fawcett's mental state during his final days among people who had known him during previous expeditions. He had spoken obsessively about finding a city whose location seemed to exist more in his imagination than in any geographic reality. He had dismissed warnings about hostile indigenous peoples as evidence that he was approaching discoveries so significant that their guardians were prepared to kill to protect them. Most ominously, he had seemed almost eager to enter territories where previous expeditions had disappeared without trace. The indigenous testimony that Dyatt collected during months of patient investigation painted a picture of three men whose fate had been determined by decisions that placed archaeological ambition above basic survival. According to multiple sources, Fawcett had chosen a route that experienced indigenous travelers avoided during the dry season. He had rejected offers of additional guides who could have provided protection in unfamiliar territories. He had insisted on carrying minimal supplies despite warnings that the regions ahead contained no reliable sources of food or shelter. Yet these accounts, however detailed and consistent, could provide no definitive answer to the question that had motivated Dyatt's expedition. What had actually happened to Percy Fawcett and his companions after they disappeared into the jungle? The Kalapalo had watched them depart but possessed no knowledge of their subsequent fate. Indigenous peoples from territories farther northeast reported no contact with European explorers. The three men had simply passed beyond the range of human observation and entered a realm where speculation replaced certainty. Dyatt's expedition returned to civilization in 1928 with enough information to fuel decades of additional speculation, but no evidence sufficient to resolve the mystery. His photographs of Kalapalo witnesses, his recordings of indigenous testimony, and his maps of the regions Fawcett had planned to explore provided invaluable documentation of the expedition's final weeks. Yet these materials also confirmed that the search area was vast enough to conceal evidence indefinitely and dangerous enough to make systematic investigation prohibitively costly in both lives and resources. The public reception of Dyatt's findings revealed how thoroughly Percy Fawcett's disappearance had captured international imagination. Newspaper coverage treated the search for a missing explorer with the kind of attention typically reserved for international crises. Book publishers competed for rights to expedition accounts that promised insider knowledge about exploration's greatest mystery. Lecture audiences filled auditoriums to hear speakers describe their theories about what had happened to the famous explorer and his companions. This popular fascination created a self-sustaining cycle of speculation and investigation that would continue for decades. Each new theory about Fawcett's fate generated expeditions designed to test its validity. Each expedition produced additional evidence that supported multiple interpretations rather than definitive conclusions. The mystery was becoming more complex with every attempt at resolution, drawing investigators deeper into a labyrinth of possibilities that seemed designed to prevent rather than enable discovery of truth. The most persistent theories about Fawcett's fate reflected broader cultural anxieties about the relationship between civilization and wilderness, European knowledge and indigenous wisdom, scientific exploration, and spiritual quest. Had he been killed by hostile indigenous peoples defending ancient secrets from European intrusion? This interpretation satisfied those who viewed exploration as inevitably leading to violent conflict between incompatible worldviews. Had he discovered the lost city and chosen to remain there rather than return to civilization? This romantic theory appealed to those who believed that true discoveries required abandoning conventional society entirely. Perhaps most appealingly, had he died heroically in pursuit of knowledge that would have transformed human understanding of pre-Columbian civilizations? This version of events preserved Fawcett's reputation while explaining his disappearance in terms that made his sacrifice meaningful rather than merely tragic. The lost city of Z became not just an archaeological hypothesis, but a monument to the courage required for pursuing truth regardless of personal cost. Indigenous peoples throughout the region found themselves subjected to increasingly intrusive investigation by Europeans convinced that tribal knowledge contained clues to Fawcett's location or fate. The assumption that indigenous peoples were concealing information about the missing explorer reflected colonial attitudes that had shaped European-indigenous relations for centuries. Native accounts that contradicted European expectations were dismissed as evasion or deliberate misinformation. Indigenous explanations that the jungle was large enough to swallow expeditions without leaving recoverable traces were rejected as implausible despite their obvious accuracy. The Kalapalo people, who had provided Fawcett's final documented shelter, faced particular pressure from investigators convinced that they possessed evidence they were unwilling to share. Their consistent accounts of watching the expedition depart towards certain death were challenged by Europeans who could not accept that a famous explorer might simply have made fatal errors in judgment. The suggestion that indigenous peoples might understand jungle dangers better than European explorers contradicted assumptions about cultural superiority that most investigators were unprepared to abandon. This European inability to accept indigenous expertise created one of the most tragic aspects of the search for Percy Fawcett. The peoples who possessed the most relevant knowledge about jungle survival were precisely those whose testimony was most likely to be dismissed or distorted by investigators operating from assumptions of European superiority. The result was a series of expeditions that repeated Fawcett's errors rather than learning from indigenous wisdom that could have prevented additional tragedies. The decade following Dyatt's expedition produced a steady stream of adventurers, scientists, and fortune hunters who believed they possessed insights or advantages that would enable them to succeed where previous searchers had failed. Peter Fleming's expedition in 1932 combined journalistic credentials with Oxford education, approaching the mystery through systematic investigation of indigenous accounts rather than romantic speculation about lost cities. His team's survival represented one of the search effort's few clear successes, though their findings only confirmed that Fawcett's disappearance had occurred in regions where systematic search was virtually impossible. Fleming's account of his expedition, published as Brazilian Adventure, provided the most realistic assessment of the challenges involved in searching for missing explorers in Amazonian wilderness. His descriptions of the jungle's vast scale its ability to conceal evidence indefinitely, and the limitations of even well-equipped search efforts offered a sobering counterpoint to romantic theories about Fawcett's fate. Yet even Fleming's analytical approach could not entirely resist the mystery's seductive power, and his book contributed to rather than diminish public fascination with exploration's greatest unsolved puzzle. The 1930s also witnessed the emergence of increasingly exotic theories about what had happened to Percy Fawcett and his companions. Spiritualists claimed to have made contact with Fawcett's ghost, receiving messages that described his survival in a lost city populated by advanced indigenous peoples who had preserved ancient wisdom while avoiding contact with modern civilization. Anthropologists speculated that he had been adopted by indigenous communities and was living as a tribal member in regions so remote that contact with the outside world was impossible. More sinisterly, some investigators suggested that Fawcett had been murdered by indigenous peoples who possessed knowledge about archaeological treasures they were determined to protect from European exploitation. This interpretation implied that systematic torture might have preceded his death, with information about lost cities extracted before the expedition members were killed to prevent their return to civilization. Such theories fed European prejudices about indigenous savagery while providing explanations for Fawcett's disappearance that preserved the possibility of spectacular discoveries awaiting future expeditions. The Brazilian government, embarrassed by their inability to locate a famous explorer who had disappeared within their territory, launched increasingly ambitious official search expeditions throughout the 1930s. These efforts combined military personnel with indigenous guides, modern equipment with traditional survival techniques, unlimited budgets with careful planning that addressed logistical challenges previous expeditions had ignored. Yet for all their advantages, government searches achieved nothing except confirmation that the Amazon was vast enough to hide evidence indefinitely and dangerous enough to claim additional lives from even the most carefully organized rescue attempts. Official expeditions discovered numerous archaeological sites that supported Fawcett's claims about sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations, but none of these finds could be connected to his specific search for the city he had called Ze. The ruins were impressive, the artifacts significant, and the implications for understanding indigenous history profound. Yet they remained generic archaeological discoveries rather than evidence of the particular lost city that had motivated Fawcett's fatal expedition. The jungle was yielding its secrets gradually, but none of those secrets illuminated the fate of the 3 men who had died seeking them. The outbreak of the Second World War temporarily reduced international interest in solving exploration mysteries that seemed trivial compared to global conflicts threatening human civilization. Yet even during wartime, the search for Percy Fawcett continued through the efforts of individuals whose obsession with the mystery had become as consuming as Fawcett's original pursuit of his lost city. Military personnel stationed in Brazil conducted informal investigations during leave periods. Intelligence operatives gathering information about Amazonian resources interviewed indigenous peoples about European explorers who had passed through their territories decades earlier. These wartime investigations produced some of the most intriguing evidence about Fawcett's possible fate, though interpretation of that evidence remained highly speculative. Indigenous peoples from regions hundreds of miles northeast of Fawcett's last known position reported encounters with European men whose descriptions matched the missing explorers. These accounts, collected decades after the supposed encounters, described meetings with white men who spoke broken indigenous languages and appeared to be living permanently in the jungle rather than passing through as temporary visitors. The most detailed of these reports came from the Xingu River region, where indigenous peoples described 3 European men who had established a settlement near ancient ruins sometime during the late 1920s. According to these accounts, the Europeans had adopted indigenous customs while maintaining their own cultural identity, creating a hybrid lifestyle that enabled survival in terrain where conventional European exploration techniques proved fatal. The leader of this group was described as an older man with extensive knowledge of indigenous languages and survival techniques, characteristics that matched Fawcett's documented abilities. Yet these tantalizing reports could never be verified through direct investigation. The regions where the encounters had supposedly occurred were accessible only through territories controlled by indigenous groups who remained hostile toward European intrusion. The witnesses who provided the accounts had no independent means of confirming that the European men they had encountered were actually the missing members of Fawcett's expedition. Most problematically, the stories improved with each retelling, acquiring details that suggested embellishment rather than accurate memory of events that had occurred decades earlier. The post-war period brought renewed international interest in solving the Fawcett mystery, fueled by technological advances that promised to make systematic search finally feasible. Aircraft could survey vast areas in hours rather than the months required for ground expeditions. Radio communication had become more reliable, enabling coordination between search teams operating across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Medical advances offered protection against tropical diseases that had killed many previous searchers. Most importantly, anthropologists had developed more sophisticated understanding of indigenous cultures, recognizing that native peoples possessed knowledge that was essential for successful jungle exploration rather than merely exotic folklore worthy of casual interest. This cultural shift created possibilities for collaboration between European searchers and indigenous guides that had been impossible during earlier decades when colonial attitudes had prevented genuine cooperation. The expeditions of the 1950s reflected these changed approaches while continuing to demonstrate the fundamental challenges that made searching for Fawcett a virtually impossible task. Orlando Vilas Boas, the Brazilian explorer who had spent decades establishing peaceful contact with previously isolated indigenous groups, possessed unparalleled knowledge of Amazonian peoples and territories. His investigations of the Fawcett mystery combined intimate familiarity with indigenous cultures, systematic approach to gathering evidence, and realistic assessment of what could and could not be determined about events that had occurred decades earlier in regions where human observation was minimal and physical evidence deteriorated rapidly. Vilas Boas's conversations with indigenous peoples throughout the suspected search area produced the most comprehensive collection of testimony about possible encounters with European explorers during the period when Fawcett's expedition might have been traveling through remote territories. His documentation revealed consistent patterns in indigenous accounts, while acknowledging the limitations of oral history that had been transmitted across generations of storytellers whose cultural context made European disappearances seem unremarkable rather than mysterious. The picture that emerged from Vilas Boas's investigation suggested that Fawcett's expedition had indeed penetrated deeper into unmapped territory than any previous European attempt, encountering indigenous peoples who had no prior experience with outside contact and who responded to their presence with suspicion that escalated into violence. According to multiple indigenous sources, 3 European men had been killed during conflicts that arose from misunderstandings about territorial boundaries, resource access, and cultural practices that each group interpreted according to their own assumptions about appropriate behavior. Yet even these detailed accounts could provide no definitive proof about the specific identity of the European victims or the exact circumstances of their deaths. Indigenous oral history preserved information about events that had significance within tribal contexts, but European explorers who violated territorial boundaries were not necessarily distinguished from other outsiders who had met similar fates. The 3 men who had died seeking Z might have been Fawcett's expedition, or they might have been any of the dozens of other Europeans who had disappeared in Amazonian wilderness during the decades when search efforts were most intensive. The 1960s brought a new generation of investigators whose approach to the Fawcett mystery reflected broader cultural changes in attitudes toward exploration, indigenous rights, and the relationship between European science and traditional knowledge. These searchers were more likely to view indigenous peoples as partners rather than subjects, more willing to accept that European explorers might have died through their own errors rather than indigenous hostility, and more interested in understanding the mystery within its proper cultural context rather than imposing European assumptions about heroic adventure and tragic sacrifice. This shift in perspective produced more nuanced understanding of what had probably happened to Percy Fawcett, while simultaneously making definitive resolution of the mystery less likely than ever. The accumulated evidence suggested multiple plausible scenarios for the expedition's fate, each supported by credible testimony, but none provable through the kind of physical evidence that would satisfy scientific standards. Fawcett had become a historical figure whose significance lay not in what he had discovered, but in what his disappearance revealed about human nature, cultural collision, and the terrible price of pursuing obsessions that transcended rational limits. The search for Percy Fawcett had evolved into something far more complex than a missing person case or archaeological investigation. It had become a mirror reflecting each generation's assumptions about exploration, indigenous peoples, and the relationship between European civilization and Amazonian wilderness. The mystery persisted not because evidence was lacking, but because the evidence supported multiple interpretations that revealed as much about the interpreters as about the original events they were attempting to understand. Modern archaeological discoveries throughout the Amazon basin had vindicated many of Fawcett's claims about sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations, while simultaneously demonstrating that his search for a specific lost city had been based on misunderstanding of how indigenous urban centers had actually functioned. The ruins he had sought did exist, scattered across thousands of miles of territory in forms that made individual discovery less meaningful than systematic investigation of entire cultural systems that had flourished for centuries before European contact. Satellite imagery revealed extensive earthworks, raised agricultural fields, and settlement patterns that confirmed indigenous peoples had modified Amazonian landscapes on scales that rivaled any European engineering projects. Ground-penetrating radar detected architectural foundations beneath jungle growth that had concealed them for centuries. Most remarkably, genetic analysis of indigenous peoples demonstrated continuities with ancient populations that suggested cultural knowledge had been preserved across generations despite the devastating impacts of European colonization and disease. These discoveries proved that Percy Fawcett had been correct about the Amazon's archaeological significance, while revealing that his romantic vision of a single lost city had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of how pre-Columbian civilizations had actually organized themselves across vast territories. The real Z was not a place, but a system, a network of interconnected settlements, agricultural complexes, and ceremonial centers that had supported populations numbering in the millions. Yet this vindication of Fawcett's archaeological intuitions could not resolve the mystery of what had happened to him during his final expedition. The jungle had kept its secret for nearly a century, and the passage of time had made definitive answers increasingly unlikely. The witnesses were dead, the physical evidence had long since deteriorated, and the cultural context that might have preserved crucial information had been disrupted by decades of outside intervention. The search for Percy Fawcett had claimed more lives than any other exploration mystery in history, yet it had also inspired achievements that justified its terrible cost. The expeditions mounted to find him had mapped previously unknown territories, established peaceful contact with isolated indigenous groups, and advanced scientific understanding of Amazonian ecosystems in ways that benefited both indigenous peoples and the broader world. The mystery had motivated discoveries that Fawcett himself could never have achieved through his individual efforts. Perhaps most importantly, the search had demonstrated the limitations of European assumptions about exploration and the importance of indigenous knowledge for understanding Amazonian realities. The investigators who had achieved the greatest success were those who had approached indigenous peoples as partners rather than subjects, those who had recognized that survival in the Amazon required adapting to local conditions rather than imposing outside technologies, and those who had understood that the jungle's secrets would be revealed only to those who approached them with appropriate humility and respect. The legend of Percy Fawcett had become larger than the man himself, a story that captured fundamental questions about human nature, cultural collision, and the price of pursuing knowledge that challenged conventional understanding. His fate remained unknown, but his impact on exploration history was immeasurable. The city he had sought might have existed only in his imagination, but the search for it had revealed truths about the Amazon that were more valuable than any archaeological treasure. The mystery persisted, as compelling in the 21st century as it had been when three men walked into the jungle in 1925 and disappeared forever. New technologies offered new possibilities for investigation, but they also revealed the vast complexity of environments where human beings could vanish without leaving recoverable traces. The Amazon remained large enough to hide its secrets and dangerous enough to claim new victims from among those who believed they could succeed where generations of predecessors had failed. Percy Harrison Fawcett had achieved a kind of immortality, though not the kind he had sought when he began his search for the lost city of Z. He had become part of the jungle's mythology, a presence that could be sensed but never confirmed, a reminder that some mysteries were more powerful than their solutions, and some obsessions more enduring than the lives they consumed. The jungle's hold on human imagination proved stronger than any physical discovery. In 1996, 71 years after Fawcett's disappearance, Brazilian researchers claimed to have found human bones in a remote area of the Mato Grosso that might belong to his expedition. The remains were subjected to DNA analysis with technology that would have seemed like magic to the missing explorer. The results were inconclusive. The bones were too degraded, the chain of custody too uncertain, the possibility of contamination too great. Yet even this tantalizing near resolution only deepened the mystery's grip on public consciousness. If these were indeed Fawcett's remains, they raised more questions than they answered. How had the three men died? Had they been killed by indigenous peoples, or had they succumbed to disease, starvation, or accident? Had they found anything resembling the lost city before meeting their fate? The bones, if genuine, provided closure of a sort while preserving the essential mystery that had made Fawcett's story so enduringly compelling. Indigenous peoples throughout the region had watched this European obsession with detached amusement for decades. The Kalapalo, whose ancestors had provided Fawcett's final documented shelter, possessed oral traditions that preserved clear accounts of what they believed had happened to the three white men. According to their cultural memory, passed down through generations of storytellers, the explorers had indeed been killed. Not through indigenous hostility, but through their own inability to survive in an environment that demanded skills they had never developed. The Kalapalo accounts, when finally recorded by anthropologists willing to listen without judgment, painted a picture of three men whose fate had been determined by cultural arrogance rather than tragic accident. Fawcett had refused indigenous guidance about safe routes, seasonal conditions, and territorial boundaries. He had insisted on carrying European equipment that was inappropriate for jungle conditions. Most fatally, he had rejected warnings about indigenous groups whose territories he was planning to enter without permission or preparation. According to these oral traditions, the three Europeans had been observed from a distance by indigenous scouts who reported their approach to territorial leaders. The decision about how to respond had been debated extensively, with some groups favoring cautious contact and others advocating complete avoidance. The explorers' behavior during this observation period, their failure to request permission for passage, their apparent indifference to territorial markers, and their obvious inadequacy as jungle travelers had ultimately determined their reception. The attack, when it came, had been swift and decisive. Three men who had entered indigenous territory without invitation and without understanding had been eliminated as potential threats to community security. Their bodies had been disposed of according to traditional practices, their equipment distributed among tribal members who could make practical use of European tools and trade goods. Within weeks, the jungle had erased all visible traces of their presence, leaving no evidence that would satisfy European investigators seeking definitive proof of what had occurred. These indigenous accounts, collected during the 1990s by Brazilian anthropologists working to document traditional knowledge before it disappeared entirely, provided the most detailed explanation of Fawcett's fate that would ever be recorded. Yet even they could not satisfy the human need for certainty about events that had occurred beyond the reach of European observation. The oral traditions were consistent and credible, but they remained indigenous interpretations of European deaths rather than European documentation of indigenous actions. The irony was profound. The people best qualified to explain what had happened to Percy Fawcett were precisely those whose testimony European investigators were least prepared to accept as definitive. Colonial attitudes that had shaped exploration for centuries continued to influence how evidence was evaluated decades after formal colonialism had ended. Indigenous knowledge was treated as folklore rather than historical documentation, interesting for its cultural perspective but inadequate as proof of actual events. This epistemological prejudice meant that the mystery would persist regardless of how much evidence indigenous peoples provided about European fates. Their accounts could never satisfy European standards for historical proof because those standards had been designed to validate European ways of knowing while dismissing indigenous alternatives. The search for Percy Fawcett had become a search for European certainty about events that had occurred within indigenous contexts according to indigenous logic. Yet the persistent fascination with Fawcett's disappearance reflected deeper currents in European consciousness that had little to do with archaeological discovery or exploration history. His story resonated because it embodied fundamental questions about the relationship between civilization and wilderness, the price of pursuing impossible dreams, and the terrible seduction of mysteries that offered immortality to those brave enough to seek their solutions. The lost city of Z had become more than an archaeological hypothesis. It had become a metaphor for everything that remained unknown and potentially unknowable about human experience. In an era when satellite imagery could map every square kilometer of the Earth's surface and genetic analysis could trace human migrations across millennia, the idea that three men could simply vanish without leaving recoverable traces seemed to challenge the very foundations of modern knowledge. This challenge to technological omniscience explained why new expeditions continued to seek evidence of Fawcett's fate well into the 21st century. Each generation of searchers believed that advances in equipment, methodology, or cultural understanding would finally enable definitive resolution of exploration's greatest mystery. Each generation discovered that the Amazon remained capable of hiding secrets from even the most sophisticated investigation techniques. The 2005 expedition led by British journalist David Grann represented the most systematic modern attempt to trace Fawcett's route and determine his fate. Grann's team combined traditional exploration methods with cutting-edge technology, indigenous guides with GPS navigation, anthropological sensitivity with journalistic determination to uncover hidden truths. Their approach acknowledged both the achievements and the limitations of previous searchers while promising to avoid the errors that had made earlier expeditions so costly in lives and resources. Grann's investigation revealed how thoroughly modern archaeology had vindicated Fawcett's intuitions about Amazonian civilizations, while simultaneously demonstrating that his romantic vision of lost cities had been based on fundamental misunderstanding of pre-Columbian urban development. The ruins existed scattered across vast territories in forms that made individual discovery less meaningful than systematic analysis of entire cultural systems that had flourished for centuries before European contact. Satellite imagery had revealed earthworks covering areas larger than many European countries. Ground-penetrating radar had detected architectural foundations beneath jungle growth that had concealed them for half a millennium. Soil analysis had identified chemical signatures of intensive agriculture that had supported populations numbering in the millions. Most remarkably, genetic studies of modern indigenous peoples had demonstrated direct descent from populations that had built and maintained these sophisticated settlement networks. The real Z was not a single lost city, but an entire lost civilization, a network of interconnected urban centers, agricultural complexes, and ceremonial sites that had supported what might have been the largest pre-Columbian society in the Americas. This civilization had been destroyed not by Spanish conquistadors, but by epidemic diseases that had arrived with the first European contact, killing 90% of the indigenous population before any European had penetrated far enough inland to document what was being lost. Fawcett had been correct about the archaeological significance of his discoveries, but he had been seeking the wrong thing in the wrong way for the wrong reasons. His vision of a single lost city had been shaped by European assumptions about how civilizations organized themselves, assumptions that had little relevance to indigenous societies that had developed different approaches to urban planning, population distribution, and territorial control. The civilization he had died seeking had indeed existed, but it had been destroyed centuries before his birth by the very European expansion that had made his explorations possible. He had been searching for ruins of cities whose inhabitants had been killed by diseases carried by earlier European explorers. His quest had been doomed not by jungle dangers or indigenous hostility, but by the temporal impossibility of finding something that had been systematically destroyed by the cultural forces he represented. This tragic irony had been invisible to Fawcett and his contemporaries because European knowledge of pre-Columbian civilizations had been shaped by assumptions that made sophisticated indigenous societies seem impossible rather than inevitable. The archaeological evidence had been there all along, waiting to be recognized by investigators willing to abandon European preconceptions about indigenous capabilities and limitations. Yet even this vindication of Fawcett's archaeological intuitions could not resolve the human mystery of what had happened to him during his final expedition. The jungle had kept that secret for nearly a century, and the passage of time had made definitive answers increasingly unlikely. The cultural context that might have preserved crucial information had been disrupted by decades of outside intervention. The witnesses had died, and the physical evidence had long since returned to the earth that had briefly supported three men whose dreams had exceeded their survival skills. Perhaps the mystery's persistence was itself the point. Percy Fawcett had achieved a form of immortality that was more powerful than any archaeological discovery could have provided. His disappearance had inspired more expeditions than his life's work, generated more literature than his actual writings, and captured more imaginations than his documented achievements. The search for him had advanced scientific knowledge, established peaceful contact with isolated indigenous groups, and mapped previously unknown territories in ways that benefited both indigenous peoples and the broader world. The city he had sought might have existed only in his imagination, but the search for it had revealed truths about the Amazon that were more valuable than any single archaeological site. His fate remained unknown, but his impact on exploration history was immeasurable. The mystery had motivated discoveries that he could never have achieved through individual effort, creating a legacy that transcended the limitations of any single human life. The Brazilian anthropologist Michael Heckenberger, working with Kwikuro people in the Upper Singu region, had documented settlement complexes that covered areas of more than 1,000 square kilometers. These were not primitive villages, but sophisticated urban centers connected by raised roads, integrated water management systems, and agricultural networks that had supported populations approaching 50,000 people. The scale and complexity rivaled anything in medieval Europe. Yet they had been dismissed as impossible by generations of archaeologists who could not imagine indigenous peoples achieving such organizational sophistication. These discoveries proved that Fawcett's vision of advanced Amazonian civilizations had been essentially correct, even if his understanding of their specific characteristics had been flawed. The archaeological sites he had glimpsed during his expeditions were indeed remnants of urban complexes that had once dominated vast territories. His intuition that indigenous oral histories preserved accurate information about these achievements had been vindicated by systematic investigation that revealed how much knowledge had been maintained despite centuries of cultural disruption. Yet the vindication came too late to save him from the obsession that had ultimately destroyed him. By the time his archaeological insights could be properly evaluated, he had been dead for decades, claimed by a jungle that had yielded its secrets only to investigators willing to work within indigenous frameworks of knowledge, rather than imposing European assumptions about how civilizations should organize themselves. The final irony was that the lost city Fawcett had died seeking was hiding in plain sight, preserved not as romantic ruins covered by jungle growth, but as living knowledge maintained by indigenous peoples whose ancestors had built and inhabited the very settlements European explorers claimed to be discovering. The Kwikuro, the Kalapalo, the Chinguano peoples were not primitive survivors of lost civilizations, but direct descendants of the urban builders whose achievements Fawcett had glimpsed but never fully understood. Their oral traditions preserved detailed knowledge about settlement patterns, agricultural techniques, and social organization that archaeologists were only beginning to appreciate. Their current territories included sites where their ancestors had lived in cities larger than any European settlement of the same period. Their cultural practices maintained technologies and knowledge systems that had enabled sustainable development in environments where European colonies consistently failed. The greatest lost city of the Amazon was not buried beneath jungle growth waiting for European archaeologists to excavate it. It was embedded in indigenous cultures that had survived 5 centuries of European contact while preserving knowledge that could revolutionize understanding of pre-Columbian achievements. The treasure Fawcett had sought was not gold or stone monuments, but human wisdom that remained alive in communities whose existence challenged every European assumption about indigenous capabilities and limitations. This recognition transformed the search for Percy Fawcett from archaeological investigation into anthropological revelation. The mystery of his disappearance mattered less than the discoveries his death had motivated. The expeditions launched to find him had established peaceful contact with indigenous groups, documented archaeological sites, and advanced scientific understanding in ways that justified their terrible cost in human lives. More importantly, the search had gradually transformed European attitudes toward indigenous peoples from colonial condescension to scientific collaboration. The investigators who achieved the greatest success were those who approached indigenous communities as partners rather than subjects, those who recognized that survival in the Amazon required learning from local experts rather than imposing outside technologies. This evolution in research methodology had made possible the archaeological breakthroughs that vindicated Fawcett's intuitions while simultaneously revealing the limitations of his approach. The lost civilizations existed, but they could only be understood through collaboration between European scientific methods and indigenous traditional knowledge. Neither approach alone was sufficient for comprehending achievements that represented genuinely hybrid forms of human development. The 21st century brought new technologies that promised to revolutionize both the search for Percy Fawcett and the investigation of Amazonian archaeology. Lighter imaging could penetrate jungle canopies to reveal architectural features that had been invisible to ground-based investigation. Genetic analysis could trace population movements with precision that made oral histories verifiable through independent scientific methods. Satellite imagery could detect subtle variations in vegetation that indicated human modification of landscapes that appeared completely natural to casual observation. Yet these technological advances also revealed the staggering complexity of environments where human beings had lived, died, and disappeared for millennia. Every square kilometer of apparently pristine rainforest showed evidence of previous human occupation. Every river system contained archaeological sites representing thousands of years of continuous habitation. Every indigenous community possessed oral traditions that preserved knowledge about territorial use, resource management, and cultural development that extended far beyond the reach of European historical documentation. The Amazon was not a wilderness where human beings had struggled for survival against hostile natural forces. It was an anthropogenic landscape that had been shaped by human intelligence and labor for millennia. The jungle that had swallowed Percy Fawcett was itself a human creation, modified by indigenous peoples who had developed sustainable technologies for forest management that maintained biodiversity while supporting substantial populations. This recognition reframed the mystery of Fawcett's disappearance within a broader understanding of human-environment relationships that challenge fundamental assumptions about the opposition between civilization and nature. He had not died in pristine wilderness, but in a cultural landscape that had been managed by indigenous peoples for centuries. His failure to survive reflected not the jungle's inherent hostility, but his inability to function within social and ecological systems that he had never bothered to understand. The real tragedy was not that 3 men had died seeking impossible dreams, but that their deaths had been preventable through cultural humility that would have enabled learning from indigenous experts who possessed encyclopedic knowledge about the territories Europeans claimed to be exploring. The indigenous guides who had warned Fawcett about seasonal conditions, territorial boundaries, and hostile peoples had offered information that could have saved his life. His refusal to accept their guidance had been a cultural choice that reflected European assumptions about indigenous capabilities rather than a rational assessment of available information. This cultural blindness had been typical of European exploration. which had consistently underestimated indigenous knowledge while overestimating European technological advantages. The result had been centuries of unnecessary deaths, failed expeditions, and missed opportunities for collaboration that could have advanced human knowledge without the terrible cost in lives that had characterized competitive exploration, motivated by national pride and individual ambition. The search for Percy Fawcett had gradually evolved into something more valuable than mere mystery solving. It had become a case study in how cultural assumptions shape scientific investigation and how collaboration between different ways of knowing can produce insights that neither approach could achieve independently. The expeditions mounted to find him had demonstrated both the achievements and the limitations of European exploration methods while revealing the sophisticated knowledge systems that indigenous peoples had developed through millennia of sustainable development in challenging environments. Perhaps most importantly, the mystery had inspired a new generation of researchers whose approach to Amazonian archaeology combined scientific rigor with anthropological sensitivity, technological innovation with cultural respect, and European methods with indigenous knowledge. These collaborations had produced discoveries that neither European science nor indigenous wisdom could have achieved alone, revealing the complex civilizations that had flourished in the Amazon while demonstrating how modern research could benefit both indigenous communities and global scientific understanding. The lost city of Z had finally been found, though not in the form that Percy Fawcett had imagined when he walked into the jungle in 1925. It existed as a network of archaeological sites, indigenous communities, and collaborative research projects that were revealing one of humanity's greatest civilizational achievements. The treasure he had sought was not gold or stone monuments, but knowledge that could transform understanding of human possibility and environmental sustainability. His disappearance remained one of exploration's greatest mysteries, but his legacy had become one of archaeology's greatest success stories. The man who had died seeking a lost city had inspired discoveries that revealed an entire lost world. The expedition that had ended in tragedy had motivated research that was transforming scientific understanding of pre-Columbian achievements and indigenous knowledge systems. Percy Harrison Fawcett had achieved immortality after all, though not through the archaeological discovery he had sought. He had become a catalyst for scientific revolution, a symbol of human courage in the face of impossible odds, and a reminder that the greatest discoveries often come not from individual heroics, but from collaborative efforts that combine different ways of knowing in pursuit of shared understanding. The jungle that had claimed his life had also preserved his legacy. Every expedition that had searched for him, every archaeological site that had been documented in his memory, every collaboration between European researchers and indigenous communities represented a living monument to the man who had died believing that the Amazon contained treasures worthy of any sacrifice. The mystery of his fate would persist as long as human beings remained fascinated by stories of courage, obsession, and the terrible beauty of dreams that exceed their dreamer's grasp. But the significance of his disappearance lay not in what had happened to three men who had walked into the forest and vanished without trace, but in what their sacrifice had made possible for future generations of explorers who would approach the Amazon with greater wisdom, deeper respect, and more adequate preparation for collaboration with the peoples who had always been its true guardians. In the end, Percy Fawcett had found his lost city after all. It existed not as ruins hidden beneath jungle growth, but as living knowledge preserved in indigenous communities whose ancestors had built the very civilizations European explorers claimed to be discovering. His disappearance had become the beginning of a conversation between cultures that had been separated by centuries of misunderstanding and mutual suspicion. That conversation was still continuing, still revealing secrets, still transforming human understanding of what had been possible in the Amazon and what remained possible for humanity's future relationship with the natural world. The greatest treasure of all was not archaeological, but anthropological, the recognition that indigenous peoples possessed knowledge that could benefit all humanity, that sustainable development was not a modern innovation, but an ancient achievement, and that the future of environmental conservation depended on learning from cultures that had maintained complex civilizations for millennia without destroying the ecosystems that supported them. Percy Harrison Fawcett had set out to find a lost city and had discovered something far more valuable: proof that human beings could create sophisticated societies that enhanced rather than degraded their natural environments. His death had made possible discoveries that would outlive any individual monument, inspire achievements that would transcend any single archaeological site, and preserve knowledge that could help humanity survive the environmental challenges that threatened the planet's future. The jungle had kept its secret about what had happened to 3 men who had entered its depths in 1925, but it had yielded far greater secrets about what human beings could achieve when they worked with rather than against the natural world, when they learned from rather than dismissed indigenous wisdom, and when they understood exploration not as conquest but as collaboration. That was Percy Fawcett's true legacy, and it would endure long after the mystery of his disappearance had finally faded into history. He had sought immortality through individual discovery and had achieved it through inspiring collective understanding. The lost city he had died seeking had become the living knowledge that his death had helped preserve for future generations, who would be wise enough to recognize its value and humble enough to learn from its guardians. The Amazon would keep its secrets as it always had, but it would also yield them gradually and carefully to those who approached with the respect and patience that Percy Harrison Fawcett had never quite managed to master. His ghost would watch over that slow revelation, a reminder that the greatest discoveries require not just courage but wisdom, not just determination but humility, and not just individual brilliance but collaborative understanding that honors all the ways human beings have learned to thrive in the world's most challenging and most beautiful places.